Welcome back. The media. Everybody has got their own views about the state of the media and how it's supposed to be to operate. And of course, because of the diversity of the media, you're going to find a diverse range of voices coming from the media. So sometimes we talk about it as just one monolithic group of people, but it isn't. It's made up of individuals. It's made up of different organizations with different views. And Samkelo Mokhine is here, as well as William Bird. If you can pick up on that concept that I've just started with now, the diversity of the media, because sometimes, as I said, it's just lumped together as one thing, but media means so many different things, isn't it? Go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. And anything from the journalists on the ground themselves to who owns the media houses for which they work and from which political persuasion they come from, or the role that they see for themselves in society, is just reflects that there are very different views, very different persuasions within the media itself, just like society. So we shouldn't be surprised when you have all these different opinions.
There's another freedom that we've never explored when we discuss this issue of media freedom, is also the freedom to consume the media. In other words, to choose which media you consume, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you can read a community newspaper over a regional newspaper or national newspaper. William Bird, if you can take this point forward.
So, in as much as we have high levels of media concentration in terms of ownership, we also still, certainly in the region, have an incredibly diverse scenario. We have several hundred, small independent publishers. We've got several hundred community radio stations, plus then some of the other regional entities, and then of course some big other media entities and broadcasters, and then there's the SABC. So on a range of levels there is a fair diversity, but what is important is that a lot of that diversity only relates to people if they're in kind of middle class and largely in urban areas. So African languages, for example, are still largely catered for by the public service broadcaster and not to a large degree by other media, which means that the access to those diverse views and opinions that we refer to is going to be less if you are living in an informal settlement and you don't have access to the internet than it is for any of us in this room that have access to the internet and are able to access media from around the world at the drop of a hat. So there is diversity if you look for it, but equally with that diversity and with that explosion of information, we've now seen this explosion of people that seek to actually muddy the waters and seek to say this isn't journalism and this is something else.
Well, and there are ethical standards by which journalists have got to operate, irrespective of which media house they work for. Samkelo, if you can expand on that.
I think the thrust or the aim of the media is to inform, educate, and I guess do that in as truthful a manner as possible. And there are various standards by which the media is expected to operate. And as William Bird has said, we've had an issue with that in terms of sticking to the standards that have been agreed to in the industry, and it's work in progress. It's just one of those things where you cannot say we've reached the point where we don't need to continue to hold the media as well responsible to certain standards, and we just have to keep at it.
The rogue unit story comes to mind because that's the main one that's used as an example, that the owners or the senior people within newsrooms determine the narrative of stories and how they should be told. There are people who believe that the rogue unit story relating to SARS is a story that needed to be told, but because of the ownership of the media house concerned and the editors concerned, that story was killed after it was published. And in itself, in other words, that story is true and had to be told, but has been removed because of corporate or political interests.
Well, it doesn't appear to be borne out by the facts, which is that if you go back and look at the press council's rulings on that story and what was presented and what would then constitute sufficient evidence to run that story, they ruled against it. And and that ruling wasn't then taken up in court. It wasn't challenged by the media house concerned, and in fact their response was to say, yes, in fact this was a big mistake. So in as much as that's an exciting conspiracy theory to hold on to, and you can see why it gains a lot of traction, it's not, you know, things in the media just don't work in such a simple manner. And again, I go back to the SABC. You had a scenario where Hlari Motsoneng attempted very clearly to drive the editorial direction of that entity. And even he, with his unfettered power, was unable to force all manner of things through. Now, if he's unable to do that where he's got completely unfettered power, imagine how difficult it is in any other kind of newsroom. You know, it just doesn't work on the simple thing where the owner phones up and says, okay, you will do this and you will say that, you know, which isn't to say that ownership doesn't influence content. So I'm suggesting that this isn't a black or a white scenario. You know, there's lots of shades of grey. And that what isn't helpful about this is to not be factual and accurate when you bring up that story, right? So when people say, oh, this is the thing and the media were this and the media was that. No, go back and read the rulings of the Press Council at the time, read the appeals, read the actual judgment, and you'll find that according to the ethical criteria of be balanced, get the facts right, be accurate and be fair, it didn't meet those criteria. So on that basis, it shouldn't have been published. Simple.
But around the world, it seems to be that this is actually a continuing trend, right? Where people are believing more and more in conspiracies and are convinced that there is what would be regarded as credible media is regarded as fake media, and what should be regarded as fake media is seen as credible media. So as consumers of media, how should people tell the difference? And maybe firstly, the phenomenon of fake news around the world, and how can you tell the media apart from genuine and fake news?
That's a bit of a difficult one, and I think the establishment of sort of fact-checking entities is helping somewhat, but you know, some of these things are going to be helpful to people that are in the urban areas. Once you move away and go into areas in our own country, that is where, you know, people listen to the radio, and as they get through the radio, that's what they believe is the narrative. It is really going to be difficult. There will be some help offered by the fact-checking agencies, but I mean, unless you stick to certain media that have been established for some time, and that, you know, you can hold responsible for if a story goes wrong, then that is better. But for you to pick up stories by yourself off whatever social media, that becomes more difficult, because all the fact-checking and all the standards go completely out the window.
Well, I mean, an argument has been made that social media, if anything, has empowered people, and some of the consumers of the media believe that social media is actually much more powerful and credible than mainstream media. I've seen arguments being made, people saying, you know, well, talking about journalists in South Africa, referring to them as Stratcom, right? And no one has gone back to check what is Stratcom and how did Stratcom come about in the modern era, talking about social media overpowering Stratcom, and therefore social media sources being more credible than so-called Stratcom journalists.
Look, I think that the issue is that you know, social media is incredibly powerful. There's no doubt about that, and most people get their media, their news from it. In that research, Reuters Institute research that they did, I think they found that just over half the people in South Africa get their news via WhatsApp channels of some sort, which is an incredible figure. You know, so the reality is it is powerful, but what's on there doesn't mean that it's necessarily credible, because the extraordinary thing about social media and the internet broadly is that if you want to believe that dinosaurs invented bicycles, I can tell you right now that you will find a source that looks credible that'll tell you that dinosaurs invented bicycles. Now, of course, there's no truth of that at all, right? But you can manufacture these things. You can have pictures of them making it and riding bicycles even, and say that they all went extinct because they stopped learning how to ride bicycles. I mean, these things, anything is possible on the internet, right? But the issue is what's credible and what's accurate and what's fair is tells us about what's actually happening in our world. And the people that we know that adhere to those things are journalists. And how do we know this? Because there's standards of ethics that they agree to adhere to. So how do you determine what's credible and what isn't? Is you go to media that you know actually have a history of being credible and being at least as far as truthful as you can get, are actually truthful. So if you look at societies where there's high levels of trust in journalism and media, formal media sources, those are entities where there's a public broadcaster that is well respected and has high levels of trust. So the simple answer is this, is that if you see something on social media that makes you feel angry or it makes you feel outraged or really upset, and it purports to be a news story, double check that before you go and share it again.
Verify with credible sources
Verify
if you
and
can.
check with a credible, and and don't do it just with one. Check with 2 or 3. If they don't have that same thing, be very cautious about that particular story. Not because the one person may not be actually right about it, but because you need perspective on that thing. And that's, I guess, the simple thing is again, it goes back to this, social media is very good at driving emotion. It's not so good at actually helping produce and promote credible news.
We live in a constitutional democracy, and free media is an important part of this constitutional democracy. And of course, for it to be sustained, as we've said, we need those freedoms. And the media itself needs the protection of the Constitution. Samkelo and William Bird, thank you very much for having been my guests. I appreciate. And that's all we had for you. Thank you for joining the Modise Network, and be sure to tune in again next week from us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.